First of all, a big hello. We've missed you and are so happy to be back recording from our closets, our basements, our bedrooms. Apologies ahead of time if the sound quality isn't quite up to our usual standards, but our stellar producer, Pedro Rosado, is doing his very best, and we hope you'll overlook any undue background noise, because now is still, perhaps even more than ever, a time to read and talk about books. Here we go. What does teenage behavior look like in the age of coronavirus, and how can parents best handle their fears, stress, antsiness, and rebellions under trying conditions? Lisa Damour, author of Untangled and Under Pressure, joins us to answer some of my questions and questions from my colleagues. What's it like being the editor of the book review and overseeing books coverage at the Times? Dwight Garner joins us to turn the tables, interviewing me about my job on the podcast and in the newsroom. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's April 3rd. I'm Pamela Paul. Lisa Damour joins us now from Shaker Heights, Ohio. She is the author of two books, Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood, and more recently, Under Pressure, Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls, which is just out in paperback. Lisa, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So listeners are probably familiar with your name because I talked about you recently on What We're Reading, and I thought, what better time to have you come on the podcast now, not just to talk about your two books, but to talk about something that I think a lot of us are dealing with, which is our children in the age of coronavirus. Many of us have even closer proximity to our own families than we did before. So I think it's an interesting time to talk to you. And I know that you've written about this a bunch for the Times recently as well. Tell us a little bit about your clinical practice and how you came to write your first book, Untangled.
I've been a clinical psychologist for more than 2 decades now, and I have always loved teenagers, which is not something that is true of every adult and certainly every clinician. But I've always loved taking care of teenagers. And so when I started practicing, I received a lot of referrals for teenagers and just built my practice very much in that direction, and was working in a very sort of traditional academic and clinical career, teaching at the college level and writing on the academic side and taking care of young people and their parents in my clinical daily work. And I would say about 10 years ago, I felt that the book I wanted to give to the families I was caring for wasn't available. I wanted a book that really laid out the normal and expectable challenges of adolescence. I think that so often there can be this big distribution in terms of what's available where the poles are well represented. So there can be, here's how to make it all awesome parenting guidance.
Right.
And then there's the, your kid is entirely off the rails parenting guidance. And I felt like the middle was missing, and the middle being, hey, normal development is a very challenging and bumpy process, but it's pretty predictable. And if you know what's coming at you, you can adjust accordingly. And so I wanted to write that book. So that's what Untangled became.
So in your practice, do you only treat adolescents? So you say basically until your child is 11? Not me?
No, my training cuts across all ages. I also take care of some grownups too. But I will say, in any community, there's a dearth of clinicians who see teenagers. So it feels like an important thing that if you like teenagers and you're comfortable taking care of them, that it's important to make oneself available to do that work a lot.
So I have to ask, because parents of teenagers know why they're difficult, but why is it that so many clinicians are reluctant to take teenagers on?
I think it gets into some really tricky questions about confidentiality and risk. The nature of teenagers, especially sometimes if they're in your private practice, is that they have been pushing boundaries a little bit. So teenagers can be impulsive, and teenagers can get themselves into things that are tricky and sometimes dangerous. And that makes clinicians uncomfortable. And then on top of that, there is this interesting dance around what's private and what's not. And when you're taking care of an adult, those questions don't come up so much because the adult is largely responsible for themselves. And when you're taking care of a little kid, the risks are lower. But teenagers are in this funny in-between space where they're doing risky stuff and you feel obliged as a clinician to make sure their parents know, but is it on the other, what side of the line of confidentiality are we on? It becomes sort of complicated. And there are plenty of clinicians, and I completely understand why, who just say, I'm not going to take that piece on.
Well, the issue of privacy is interesting too when you're writing a book, because one of the things that I appreciated so much about your work in your books is that when you give examples, case histories, they feel very real. Whereas sometimes in parenting books, you feel like you're getting some kind of very diluted version of a child or an amalgam of multiple characters. So I'm curious how you work in terms of taking your clinical practice and using some of these stories in your book and handling privacy that way?
It's a great question, and one that really has, profound ethical implications that weighed very heavily on me while I was writing. So there were two things that happened. One is that I have practiced long enough that I get to see patterns. I get to see dynamics that recur and recur and recur. So those are the things that I then write about because I know they'll have a general reach. And so often the stories that come into the book are about a central dynamic, a particular kind of disagreement between a parent and child, or a particular form of friction that unfolds between peers. And when I'm writing, I'm imagining all 15 cases where I saw this come up, and I sort of mash them together in my head and present the story. So it's very much a concentration of a repeated phenomenon. There were times where the details were so important to me in terms of the telling of the story that I thought, ooh, the person I'm thinking of might recognize themselves. And so what I did was I checked with them first before putting it in. And my standard was, it must be that the people who have sat with me and trusted me with their intimate lives either cannot recognize themselves in my books, or have authorized me, but no one else could recognize them. And that was the standard I held for myself.
We are speaking right now during what I think is probably the second or third week for many families of what is isolation or quarantine. Many schools are closed, so it's very particular circumstances. What is the most common concern that you're hearing from parents of teenagers right now?
I'm hearing things on two sides. One thing I think worth noting is that a lot of parents are saying, my kid seems less stressed than they have been. And I want to acknowledge that this is, obviously a horrible circumstance and one that we want to get through as safely and quickly as possible. But in the day-to-day of a lot of adolescents' lives, some things just got easier. They're sleeping more, there are fewer demands on them. And so at least in this immediate term, for some kids, this is actually not worse. It may, in fact, be easier in the day-to-day. But that's the short term. I think the other question that I'm hearing about and thinking about a lot is how do we foster healthy development and growth under chronic stress conditions? And that's what is coming at us, if not already here. And this is a question that psychologists have actually looked at over time. We've never studied pandemic conditions, as far as I can tell in the literature, but there's a really valuable tradition in psychology of looking at kids under terrible chronic stress conditions, incredible privation, other forms of real hardship, and looking at the kids who thrive and asking this really critical question of, okay, well, what's going on for the kids who thrive that's not going on for everyone else? And that literature has answers for us and is hugely informative at times like this.
Well, what is going on? Like, is it grit? Like, what is it that makes some kids better able, better equipped to handle it? Is it just temperament? They're born with this?
Well, there are some biological features. There's no question that when we really look closely, that there are things that help kids. If they are bright, if they are, good behavioral control, those things help. But there's this beautiful phrase that comes from Anne Maston, who's a psychologist, where she talks about the ordinary magic that can happen in homes that is extraordinarily protective for kids. And I love the term ordinary magic because she's saying, these are not, invincible or unusual children. These are things that people can help make happen. And so she talks about, and actually the literature as a whole talks about things like giving kids control where you can. So when everything is feeling so chaotic and out of control, to the degree that there can be some sense of control, actually both for the adults and the kids, we're in better shape. So this means things like routines and autonomy when we can grant it. I've been trying to think about, with my own teenager and younger daughter, thinking about saying to them, all right, these are the expectations for the day, and then here's when you're totally off the clock. You can do as you please, you get your freedoms, you're not used to being with us so much. So things like that matter. Things like doing meaningful work, kids being able to maintain their schoolwork at whatever level schools can manage or families can manage, lets them get to the end of the day and point to some sense of achievement or accomplishment. And that turns out to be highly protective, as is being of help to others, getting food, if you can, to people who need it, or reaching out to grandparents. We also see things like how everybody chooses to cope. And this is going to be true for the grown-ups and true for the kids. There are negative coping strategies that do provide immediate and short-term relief, being hard on the people around you, maybe drinking a little too much, things like that. And there are positive coping strategies, exercising, getting good sleep, being connected in really loving ways. I am convinced that the back end of this will be entirely determined by how people choose to cope through it. That if people find themselves on a negative coping strategy path, either as adults or kids, their resilience will wear down over the long term. If they can get themselves on a positive coping path, they will sustain well over the long term.
Well, I'm glad you brought up grown-ups, because one question I think a lot of parents have with regard to their teenagers, and this is different from the kinds of ways you would handle it with younger children, is that many parents are feeling stressed themselves and not sure, do they share it? Do they hide it? Will it exacerbate any anxiety their children are having? What is the best strategy, or is it really on a case-by-case basis?
It's probably case by case, but there's some good guidelines that we can have in mind. One is, let's not scare our children. If we can prevent that, we should. I think this all feels pretty uncertain and out of control. And the way I think about it a little bit is, we're driving the car, they're the passengers. If we're screaming at the wheel, they're not going to feel better about this. So I think we need to really try to manage that piece of it. Then the other guideline would be, parents have every right to be stressed. Parents are going to be stressed. To the degree they share that with their children, I would love to have them say, okay, I had a heck of a day. I am really feeling worn down. Let's go for a walk outside. That they use that as a juncture to talk about positive coping options. The alternative, I've had a terrible day. Wait, why didn't you do that thing? Now I'm all cranky with you. I've picked a fight and now I feel better. Not great, but better than I did before. That I think these are those sort of choice moments in terms of modeling positive or negative ways of getting through hard times.
So if you say to your child, I'm going to come up with a very realistic example because that's what you do so well in your book. I've had a stressful day. I'm going to take a walk outside. Would you like to come? And your teenager says, yeah, I'll come if I can wear my earbuds while we're walking. What do you say to that?
I think I'd probably say, sounds good.
Really?
Yeah, I think everybody needs to do what's going to work for them right now. And so long as they're not harming other people or making other people's lives harder, I think there's a lot of room for gentleness right now. I've been thinking about this a lot, like being gentle with ourselves, being gentle with our kids and the people around us. And so, the adult in that moment gets to make a choice. They can feel hurt and take that personally, or they can think, I'm glad to have your company and I'm glad my kid's getting outside. Bring the earbuds.
All right, I'm going to stick to reality here. This is not a call-in show. We don't have the ability to take calls. But when I told a group of my colleagues yesterday that I was going to be talking to you today, we actually set up a Slack channel, as one does in these working from home days. I asked them to send along their questions, and some of these are coronavirus specific. Some of them are just about adolescence, and some of them kind of combine the two, right? Because teenagers continue to be teenagers under corona, but maybe even more so in some ways. So I'm going to segue into some questions from my colleagues, and I'll start with one here. And this person writes, I'm really troubled by the way that social interactions beginning in the tween years, when kids typically get phones, take place predominantly via phones, in text messages or group chats, or else on social media. The thing I've noticed is that these quote unquote social interactions via devices so predominate their lives that they've barely noticed the transition to social distancing. It's not hard on their social lives, really. They're interacting the same way they always have. And yet, especially for my younger tween, 11, the interactions are not really very social. The Instagram feeds she follows, not to mention her own, are marked by a devastating sameness. Endless variations on the same selfie, making cross eyes, pouting, sticking her tongue out. These kids are basically interacting with their reflections, not one another, kind of performing for an abstract audience, not engaging in anything that I recognize as friend behavior. Not a question there, but maybe what do
Yeah.
you make of that?
There's a lot to make of that. First thought I have is, oh, thank goodness for social media right now. Can you imagine when we were teenagers? If we were under these conditions, we would have just hijacked the home phone
Yes.
all day. So there's this piece of it that I feel like, holy moly, kids want to be connected. They want to be with their friends. Thank goodness there's technology that makes that possible, given that this may go on for a good long while. So that's my first thought. Then I always am cautious that assuming what social media means to us is the same as what social media means to kids. So, for example, that observation, which I think is very accurate, that there's sort of this mindless scrolling through multiple versions of the same image or, kind of a theme of an image. I almost wonder if for kids, that's a little bit of a boredom management strategy or like flipping through a magazine and just looking at the pictures. I don't know that they would consider that to be active socializing activity. And so I think we need to be open to the idea that social media serves a lot of purposes for kids that are quite different from the purposes it serves for adults. And they may, in fact, be purposes that we also meet, but just in a different way.
Well, I'm going to continue with a comment that seems related to that and to the first one. And this person says, it seems like the dependency on these devices is not setting up young girls, I don't know anything about boys, to function well in more adult social setting, i.e. the working world, or even, frankly, in friendship. Their social lives, I'm generalizing grossly here, strike me as immeasurably impoverished.
We don't necessarily have the data to say that's true on the grand scale. And what is true, in my experience, is that how kids use social media and how they understand it to fit into their lives really changes as they age. And I will say 12 and 13-year-olds tend to use it in ways that probably would rub a lot of adults the wrong way, that seems superficial, that seems very like dependent or, caught up in trying to get likes. And the beautiful thing about teenagers is they grow and change really, really fast. And there's a neurological watershed at age 14 where kids suddenly become a lot more sophisticated and a lot more able to observe their own behavior and others from a lot of different perspectives. And in my experience, if you go talk to a sophomore, junior, or even certainly high school senior, they have a very different view of social media and how it fits into their lives. And they don't use it like 12 and 13-year-olds anymore. So I'd love to avoid a broad brush when thinking about teenagers because 12-year-olds and 18-year-olds, they're almost not even from the same species anymore. And what I would be worried about would be a 17-year-old who uses social media like a 12 or 13-year-old.
Well, I'm going to get to older teens in a moment, but I have a couple more questions from those with tweens and younger teenagers. So this person says, I'm worried about girls who are on the precipice of gaining more access to technology, that our current situation has pushed them over the edge. They're on their devices all the time because they use them for school, to connect with friends, to entertain themselves. I'm afraid it's going to be impossible to go back to the world before, when it felt like there were clearer divisions and it was easier for me to make them get off the iPad.
What we're all trusting is the world will come back to where it was before and those structures will return. And there's two big principles here that I think we can fall back on in the meantime. One is that when we look at the data, and we've seen this in multiple studies, The way kids use social media tends to reflect how they function in their real lives, social interactions. So what that means is if kids have positive and friendly and supportive in real life relationships, that tends to be mirrored online. So if your child has a solid social life and good social skills, I would say for now, don't worry too much about the amplification of social media. It's probably going to just be more of that on this particular channel. If your child was struggling socially, either not able to make good connections or often finding themselves caught up in conflict, that for me is more grounds for concern right now, because that's likely to be mirrored online as well.
Well, that brings me to the next question. Someone here said, I think my 11-year-old has trouble reading social cues, and I wonder to what extent her life on devices has blunted that part of her development so that she's apt to overreact to casual comments at school or misinterpret stuff now that it's all online.
There are some data telling us that if kids spend way too much time online, it can interfere with their ability to read social cues. But that gets us to this second principle that I think will really get us through this time, which is to think about not being against social media or technology. I mean, we need it more now than we ever have, but to actually establish what you're for. So here are some things I think families can be for. They can be for a really good night's sleep, which we can finally be getting, a lot of us.
Yes.
They can be for going outside and spending time in spring. They can be for exercise. They can be for contributing to the household through chores. They can be for having face-to-face conversations that are not interwoven with, checking one's phone the whole time. And it's easier to actually be for something than against something. So I would have families articulate what they're for and then make social media crowd around the edges of those things. And that will help as we then transition back into our more standard lives. Those lives had a lot of things that we already do and are already structured, and that social media has to find a way to fit in on the edges of.
Well, here's a question from a parent of an older teenager. She asks, if Lisa had a crystal ball, what are the long-term effects of isolation on teenagers? I have a 19-year-old who is just launched, just acclimating to college, just found the elusive friend group she wanted so badly in high school, had just landed the summer job of her dreams far from home. Now she is boomeranged back to her 16-year-old self, under my thumb, separated from kids who felt like family, homesick for a life she only knew for 6 months, which was to her everything. On the one hand, I want her to get a grip. I am, as my husband says, going Irish. On the other, I wonder what the new now means for kids who are on the brink of everything. Will they rebound? Is it fair to be equal parts annoyed with them and bereft for them? Shouldn't they stop stealing our computer charger? I think we can discount the last part, but
Yes,
the
to
rest
all
of
of
it is
that.
very heartfelt.
So let's start with the hard news and then let's look at the good news. So the hard news is this just stinks. For young people who are just out the door and just spreading their wings, to have them clipped so quickly, it just stinks. And I think bereft is a good word and empathy is in order. And none of us would have ever wanted this for ourselves, and we don't want it for our kids. And that's a hard part that we just have to sit with. And the other hard part is when you get with your parents, you regress. This is true of us at 50, if our parents are still alive. This is true of our kids at 18, 19. If they come home, like this wonderful question asker mentioned, they suddenly start acting like a 16-year-old. So the challenge in this is to not regress too much as a parent and to fall into that trap. But to remember, these young people were managing their lives very effectively or effectively enough at college, and we can expect that they can operate at a higher level now that they're home. All right, here's the good news. 2 pieces of it. Young people are fundamentally resilient. They are adaptable. They are nimble. I am not in a grand scale worried that this is going to somehow put a huge dent in the development of an entire generation of late adolescents and early adults. They really bounce. The other thing we see consistently in the research about people who weather stressful life experiences, and this is a big, giant one, if they are able to weather them, if they are able to get through them unharmed, they go on to be more resilient in the face of new difficulties. So all of our young people will have other crummy things that happen to them. And what is happening right now is their yardstick for what constitutes a crisis is changing. This is a crisis. When they go back into their lives and they don't like their professor or, somebody dumps them, their sense of how big a crisis that is will be recalibrated.
We have given them all perspective, you're saying.
Yes. Big, giant perspective all at once that no one wanted.
Coronavirus has given them all that perspective.
Yeah. And we know this from the literature, that people become more durable when they endure difficult circumstances and they get to keep that durability over time.
Two quick questions on the opposite side of the spectrum, because there is a lot that is being discussed with kids who are feeling anxious and how do you handle their anxiety. On the other end of the spectrum, this person says, quarantine doesn't seem to be affecting my daughter much since so much of her digital life already happened via text. There is this idea that people are almost worried that their kids aren't worried enough. And another person mentioned being online at a supermarket the other day, and she's immunocompromised. She's necessarily very concerned about being out there with a group of teenagers behind her that were not social distancing, acting like nothing was wrong, were sort of seemingly untouched by all of this. What do you do if you feel like your child maybe isn't taking it seriously enough? Do you just let them glide by?
Well, in the first scenario, I think, sure, right? If your kid's doing okay, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If they're doing the things they need to be doing and taking good care of themselves and being, a decent member of the family, I would leave it be for now. If there's a problem, you'll know. The second one is tricky, where teenagers get together and they know what they're supposed to do, but they don't do it. And this is, something that happens with teenagers outside of coronavirus. They go to parties, they know what they're supposed to do, and they don't do it. And this is a reality of adolescence. It's worrisome, especially when there's risks involved. And I think that one of the questions I'm hearing people start to ask is, what do we do in public when we see people around us not observing the health guidelines that have implications for all? And I don't know that I have a straightforward answer on that. I think it's going to be very context dependent. I think it depends on how good your sense of humor is or your mood in the moment. But this is something that certainly teenagers may be well represented in the category of people who aren't taking this seriously enough, but they are not the only ones. And it's something we need to figure out as a culture.
I have about 10 more questions for my colleagues, but we are basically out of time. So we'll probably have to have another segment sometime in the future, especially about things that we didn't have a chance to address, people concerned about Me Too issues among tweens and teenagers, lots of things that aren't necessarily related to our current crisis situation. But if I could ask one final question, parting words of advice for parents of teenagers and maybe in particular teenage girls right now during this time.
Get your empathy on would be my parting words of advice, that this is hard on adults and it's hard on kids. Teenagers feel things intensely. They are addicted to their autonomy as they should be. And I try to think about teenage years for me are almost like dog years, that a year in the life of a teenager is really like 7 years in the life of an adult. A lot happens. They grow and change fast. And it also means that if they are missing their senior spring, they're missing 3 or 4 months of life against a relatively, much shorter time on this planet than adults have enjoyed. And so if there are moments when it feels like your teenager is being overly dramatic or overly self-centered about all that's going on, I would start with empathy and see if that doesn't help to contain and soften their sadness. It can be easy, I think, at these times to feel brittle and short-tempered. And the more we can do to just be tender with ourselves and everyone who is in our close quarters, the better we're going to all come through this.
Well, I feel less brittle and stressed. So thank you so much, Lisa, for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Lisa Damour is the author of 2 books, Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood, and more recently, Under Pressure, Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls. We're going to to do something a bit different this week and turn the tables. Dwight Garner, our critic who is currently in West Virginia, has been asking if he could ask me some questions for quite a while now. And so, Dwight, here you go.
Thanks, Pamela, but better late than never. It's my experience that when I really like a podcast, at some point, I want the host to be interviewed on their own show, because usually the reason I like a podcast is because I like the host. And sometimes all the host does for years and years is ask somebody else questions. And I just, I wanted to hear you talk because I love to hear you talk. So let's go. I guess the thing on my mind now, and the thing on a lot of your readers' minds, I suspect, is how do you and your staff put out the book review when you're all working separately from home?
It has been a challenge. I think we've finally somewhat mastered it, although challenges will continue to present themselves. So anyone who's been to our offices knows that even in the so-called paper-free era, a place like the book review is not paper-free, very far from it. We get boxes and boxes of books and galleys coming into the office every day. They get entered into a database. They get physically sorted. Dwight, you've done this job yourself when you were a senior editor at the Book Review years ago, where we physically throw them into either a garbage bin or into a mail carton that goes to one of our preview editors, who then is tasked with looking at it. And then we keep books filed, sorted on shelves. We have a huge set of rolling bookshelves, these kind of condensed bookshelves that you have to unlock every day and roll apart. If they were actually set up as freestanding bookshelves, they would, in order to conform to sort of fire safety code standards, take up like a full floor of the New York Times. And I think, we had to pay something like $20,000 just to have the floors underneath them reinforced in order to carry the weight of all those books.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. We had to do that. We moved at one point from the 5th floor of the Times to the 4th floor, and there had to be a whole construction process in which they then reinforced the floors of the 4th floor in order to accommodate our books. So not having books is a bit of a challenge. We have many editors who, like myself, frankly, prefer to read on paper rather than read on screens, but now need to read everything on either PDFs or NetGalley or Edelweiss or any service that kind of provides an electronic version of a book in order to decide whether to review it and then to work on that review. I don't know about you, Dwight, down in West Virginia. I'm going to try not to turn the tables back on you and ask you questions, but you're probably doing the same thing. At some point, you'll have to convert over to e-galleys because publishers are no longer sending out physical books. And when we left the office, a week later, I got a notice that mail had arrived at the book review. And what should they do about it? And I said, well, have them put it in one of our locked galley rooms. And they said there's 167 boxes.
Oh, God. So are you still opening those boxes?
No, there's no one there to open those. But that's 1 week
man.
of books that we missed, because normally we have people who help us unload those boxes twice a day. And many of our editors still open their own boxes. Recently, for environmental reasons and just waste, we've asked publishers to stop sending so many copies of various books because it's duplicative. So that actually happened before coronavirus. I'm hoping the number of books will drop off, but publishers also are not producing the physical galleys right now because there is nowhere to send them safely.
And so let me ask, publishers are canceling books now. Authors don't want their books emerging right now because they feel the readership is too scattered. No one's going to be able to find out about them or buy them in a bookstore. Are you finding that reviews you've sent out to critics and have scheduled and are now being pushed back?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, they're not being canceled altogether. They are, as you said, they're being delayed. And it's an interesting time for those kind of delays because this year, 2020, was an odd publishing year in that it's an election year. And during an election year, publishers tend to avoid publishing books, particularly nonfiction, in the fall. Now, they don't do this because nobody wants to read in the fall. That's not true. They've done studies that show that people continue to read books in the fall. The reason they do it is because of media time on television and radio. It's very hard to get a booking for an author on an NPR station or on one of the news stations or the major breakfast shows, for example, during an election because there's so much news to cover, and very frequently you'll get bumped. And that's hard, especially for an author who doesn't live in New York City, for example, or in a major town that has an affiliate studio, because you can't just keep flying the person in to go on a show that then keeps getting canceled. So this year, publishers were avoiding the fall, and they had kind of front-loaded the spring, and then they had delayed a bunch of nonfiction books that normally would be sort of your big fall nonfiction books until 2021. Now what's happened is that many of the April was a little bit late to move many things, so a lot of April pub dates have stayed the same. But May and June and even July books are being now bumped either into the fall or even further into 2021.
So how will that affect, will you have enough things to put in the book review, enough books to review?
One of the sad parts about running a book review is that you never have enough space to review all the books that deserve to be reviewed. We review probably about 1% of the books that are published in any given year. So it's not that there aren't enough books, but it means that the kinds of books that we're covering may be a little bit different. And we started having our first conversation last week, editors at the book review, about our best books of 2020 and what that's going to look like. And in a way, it's a bit of an opportunity because already a number of books weren't coming out this year due to the election. And so it means that books that perhaps might not have gone recognized as best books of the year will have an opportunity. So I'm looking at the bright side, Dwight, is what I'm saying.
This seems like, speaking of the bright side, one of the few bright sides of this situation, it seems like a perfect time to get a lot of reading done. Having said that, I'm finding it very hard to concentrate on books. And I wonder if you feel the same sometimes. I wonder if the critics you reach out to, the reviewers, are anxious to have a distraction and write for you, or whether they're feeling, I'm not sure they want to do it now.
No, people are actually jumping on assignments. I think people welcome the distraction. And personally, for me, I don't find it hard to read right now. I find it a relief, a diversion. What I do find hard to read, paradoxically, for someone who works at a news organization is news. I was actually reading a great article in the New York Times Magazine that I only finished this morning after holding on to it for about a week. It's not even about coronavirus. It's about this really terrible situation that happened with a lesbian couple in academia in which one of them was falsely accused, and then both were falsely accused of sexually harassing their students, and the sort of turmoil that took them through and the complexities of the law and of the way in which academia works. So it's a kind of horrible story. It had an okay ending, a not terrible ending, but it was so excruciating that on top of coronavirus, and because it was very real, I found it hard to get through. So it took me about a week to read that magazine story, sort of one page at a time.
Right.
But books are totally different. So I've actually found it a very welcome escape.
You were and are a well-regarded nonfiction writer before you became the editor of the book review, so you are used to working from home. I'm wondering if you have any advice for listeners. I mean, do you get up and get dressed to go to a desk every morning in your house, or do you just put on sweatpants and flop on the couch? How do you deal?
I always think about Robert Caro, who would get up and get into a suit every day before he starts writing and leave his house and go to an office in another building. He said that habit stemmed from, I think, his school days at St. Bernard's or Collegiate or some, wonderful New York City private school. And I don't have that kind of total discipline. As you know, before I came to the Times, I worked from home for 9 years. So I'm used to working from home, although it's been a while. And one of the great things about working from home is to be in your pajamas all day. I actually find it kind of onerous to have to get dressed. And many of our meetings now at the book review are being done by Google Hangout, as I expect a lot of other people who continue to have full-time employment are working together. And my camera is generally off. And it's not because I'm trying to be standoffish, but generally because it's that I haven't gotten dressed yet. I'm busy, actually. I've been incredibly busy with work, and the normal kind of tempos of my day have shifted because I usually would do my writing on my train commute. And now, without a train commute, I don't have a kind of designated period to do my writing. So that's sort of all fallen apart.
So what are you reading, Pamela? I mean, I assume you're reading a lot of advanced copies of books for work, but what are you just reading for yourself right now?
I actually read a book that you got me to read through one of your reviews, which is Claire Tomalin's memoir, A Life of My Own, which came out in 2018. And it's funny because your review was not a huge read, and yet it piqued my interest. And I remember at the time I said to you, or I think I said to John Williams, your editor, do I have to read this now? Because I'm always looking for an excuse not to read something because there is so much that I want to read. And I think you said something like, no, you don't have to read it. But nonetheless, I kept a copy. I have a kind of built-in triage system at work. I think probably a lot of us have some version of this where books will stay on my shelf at work for a period of time in a kind of purgatorial state in which I'm not sure if I'm actually going to bring them home. And every once in a while, I'll go through and decide to clear out things that haven't made the cut. And the Claire Tomalin was there for a really long time, well over a year before I brought it home. And I had this huge pile of books assembled, trying to figure out what I was going to read next. And this was during Corona. And I ended up choosing the Claire Tomalin, I think because it had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with anything except obviously peripherally my day job. So Claire Tomalin, for those who aren't familiar with her, is probably best known now as a biographer. She has written biographies of Samuel Pepys, of Dickens, of Thomas Hardy. Her first major biography was of Mary Wollstonecraft. And then before that and during it, to some extent, she was also the literary editor of the New Statesman and then of the Sunday Times. So the closest thing that she has to me is that we kind of have the same day job, except that she had hers during the 70s and 80s. So her deputies were, at one period, Martin Amis, with whom she had a brief affair, and Julian Barnes. So it was a really different time. It was during the newspaper strikes, during Rupert Murdoch's early ownership of the Sunday Times. She worked under the great Harry Evans. All these personalities kind of flit in and out of the book, which I really enjoyed. And then it's also, of course, about her personal life. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, Dwight, because you read the book. The weirdest thing about this book, and this is one of those things that I just love, is that the book I read immediately before this was A Mystery by Dorothy Sayers. And early in the Claire Tomalin, she mentions that while she was being interviewed, I believe at Cambridge, she mentioned to her tutor that she liked the books of Dorothy Sayers, and the tutor was horrified that she would admit to such a thing.
Sink so low.
Yes, exactly. I love those inadvertent hand waves between books. And then really weirdly, I'm in a book club, and my book club has just decided.
I find it hilarious that you are in a book club, as if you don't have enough books in your life, Pamela Paul.
Well, the book club that I'm in, which I think I've talked about before, the only reason I'm in it, well, two reasons. One is the people. It's got a great group of people, most of them literary in some way, agents or publishers or writers, some of them not at all. It's the people, and it's the fact that we only read children's books, so they're short and easy.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so it's the only book club that I've ever succeeded.
Yeah, I'm always shocked because I would rather cut off a toe than belong to a book club.
Oh, that's my general feeling, Dwight. That's my general feeling because I don't want to read what I don't want to read. And the other thing about this book club is that it has a strict no guilt policy. So you do not have to show up every month, or 6 weeks is more like when we meet. And even if you do show up, you don't have to have read the book. So it's a very low maintenance book club in that regard. And our next meeting is going to be in 2 weeks via Zoom, but the organizer sent out a note and asked everyone what they were reading. And one of the other members said he was reading the Claire Tomalin, which I just kind of find shocking, again, of all the books. And I then posted the book on Instagram, and another member of my book club then commented on the post saying that after Jonathan and I had said we were reading it, she started listening to it on audio. So now there's this kind of whole group randomly reading this memoir from 2018.
I love it. Pamela, we're out of time. Here's a last question. When this is all over, please let it be soon. What do you miss? What can't you wait to do when you can just be free and out in the world again?
Dwight, I'm going to sound like the biggest suck up when I answer this question, but it's true. I miss going to work. I miss being at the New York Times. I miss being with my colleagues. I miss my commute. I miss being in that atmosphere of the newsroom. I miss the serendipitous crossings in the hallway and in the elevator. Everything that we do now, every interaction we have now is extremely intentional. And on the one hand, that kind of strips away a lot of wasting of time and small talk. But it's that small talk, it's those surprises, those human buffers that really enrich our daily lives. So I miss that.
Pamela, thanks for this.
Thank you. Dwight, next time I'm doing this to you.
Fine, but you should just be interviewed every week. That's be perfect.
Coming up soon, Dwight. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
I miss seeing you in our office.
I miss seeing you too.
And in our podcast studio. What's going on out there in the world of books?
Well, I haven't been out of my house much, but I have been following all of the economic impact on the publishing industry, which has been pretty bleak. Not a total collapse, but every corner of the industry is being affected, from independent bookstores that have had to close due to shelter-in-place orders to chains like Barnes & Noble, which has closed. I believe the latest count I saw was 400 of its stores, and it operates around 630. And you're seeing authors, of course, have their incomes affected. They're not able to go on tour. They're not able to have their normal speaking engagements. And all the literary fairs and festivals have been canceled. So as James Daunt, the chief executive of Barnes & Noble, put it to me in an interview, basically the literary world is in an induced coma right now, is what he said. So it is a difficult time for publishers and authors. On the other hand, sales have not fallen precipitously, and there are strong pockets of sales that are picking up, particularly in children's nonfiction. That's obviously a result of parents having to homeschool their kids. So those books are selling tremendously well. I think according to NPD Bookscan, they were up more than 70% in the most recent week that was tracked. And the other thing I think that the industry has going for it is that, unlike, say, a big blockbuster movie or a sporting event, I think, books are kind of the ideal medium for this moment. Everyone's sheltering in place, but people still want to escape. They want entertainment and they want to feel a sense of connection. And so books are kind of perfect right now for people that are looking for that kind of connection. So as long as the supply chains and the delivery mechanisms aren't disrupted too terribly, there's a sense that the industry can sort of weather this.
Now, there was a period early on in which Amazon was prioritizing shipments of things like masks and cleaners and things that were directly related to the coronavirus, and there were delays on book shipments. Has that ended?
I think you're still seeing delays on some books, and I don't know that it's a policy that is well defined at the moment. I've heard different things from different publishers. Some say, yes, Amazon is delaying shipments of books because they're prioritizing essential goods right now, and you can understand why that would be necessary. But other publishers are seeing their books go out on time, and if you kind of go on the site and poke around, you'll see some books will arrive in 2 days and some books will take a few weeks. So it seems to be a little bit scattered. But I know that Amazon had told the people they work with, their sellers, the companies they work with, that they were really focused on essential goods right now. I think another big question is the warehouses that the publishers operate. Right now, companies like Penguin Random House have their own warehouses, and so far those are up and running. Ingram, which is one of the biggest distributors for publishers, including for independents, is still up and running in all of its distribution centers. But if you did have issues with the health of the workers there, and we've seen in some other countries, distribution centers have been shut down in the UK, for example, then I think that would be a problem. Then you're not able to get print books out even. And so then luckily the industry has ebooks and audiobooks. So there's other ways to keep people reading, to keep them entertained. But it is kind of a really uncertain moment. So
is there a surge in ebook downloads?
Those haven't been reflected yet in the industry figures that I track. There's usually a lag time for that. Anecdotally, publishers have said, yes, they have seen a big spike in ebooks, not necessarily as much as they had expected in audio. And I think that could be because people aren't commuting. And commuting time was a big time when people would listen to audiobooks. But I do think, there are those options for people. And there's been a very good resource for independent bookstores who are, for the most part, I think with maybe a few exceptions, all shut down, in states across the country. Like, most of the independents have shut down. Some have started to have to lay off their workers. But there's a new website that was launched just a couple months ago called Bookshop. And they were kind of pitching themselves at the time as the independent answer to Amazon. So you can go on there and you can buy from independents and you will get your book mailed to your home directly from Ingram. So right now, bookstores that are participating, and many more have signed up since the crisis began, can actually continue to sell books and have them sent to customers without even having their stores open.
My heart really goes out to the authors, of course, who have books that are coming out now. Some of them have their books delayed and have to rearrange their entire lives around the new publishing date, which again, in the broad scheme of things, of course, when people are dying and people are sick, I want to put it all into perspective.
Of course, yeah.
But within this world, that can be very traumatizing, very destabilizing if you are working around an academic calendar or other work that you do or around childcare. All of those sort of things that people mapped out are gone. But I think it's probably worse for the writers who have books that are coming out right now or have recently come out. Their book tours are canceled. Everything that they had lined up in terms of getting the word out has evaporated. And especially if you're a debut author, where you're just not a known quality at all. What are you hearing from writers and from editors of those kinds of books?
Yeah, the authors and editors I've spoken to are very concerned about their books kind of disappearing into the ether right now. When an author has a tour planned, it not only means interacting with readers and appearing at bookstores, but often there's local media that covers those events. And so it has an amplifying effect. And of course, there's very little room in the news right now for anything but the public health and the economic crisis. So that is a concern. And like you said, it's also very disruptive to move a book. A lot of authors get their advances in chunks, and part of it is delivered when the book is published. So if you're kind of, depending on that money when your book is published, I don't know how publishers are handling that, but I presume they're having to delay those payments. Similarly, for publishers, when they push back a publication date for a book like, Jeff Kinney's latest book, he's, of course, the author of the Wimpy Kid series, they were planning a 3 million copy printing. It was supposed to come out in early April. Now they're sitting in warehouses. So that's a huge chunk of revenue that would have come in the spring that they're not going to see until the fall. So that throws, everything off for them. Not to mention, when you jam everything else now into the fall and there's going to be a presidential election, there's going to be a lot of competition for attention and sales then. And, it is a little bit concerning, I think, for authors. But everyone says, as you mentioned, it's not the top priority. Everyone's very understanding about canceling tours and even moving pub dates because everyone's dealing with a national emergency.
Well, Alexandra, you know that I like to keep my grim news inside of books.
I do.
So I want to end on a positive note, which is to say that one nice thing that we have seen here at the book review and on the books desk at the Times is that our readers, at least, are very much interested in continuing to read about books. I'm getting lots and lots of emails, people reaching out, grateful to have the diversion of stories and stories about stories. So I am hoping that those stories will continue to carry us through these difficult times, even if the paychecks don't.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a real need and a desire right now for connection and escape, and books are perfect for that.
We'll end on that happy note, Alexandra. It's been very nice connecting with you.
Lovely to hear your voice.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues John Williams and Greg Coles. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
I'm in a closet. Where are you guys?
I'm in my basement.
I'm in a little study that I have in my apartment.
I feel like I should post a photo of my recording space right now. I kind of thought that the clothing would provide some amount of sound insulation. I'm not sure if it's working. It's a very different atmosphere from our workspace studio.
Yes, mine too. I can't post a picture because it's way too messy.
So this is the question a lot of people are asking. I'm going to ask it of you guys. What are you reading during the current situation?
I find it a little hard to read during the week but on weekends I'm starting to get in a groove. And one thing I found, which is really strange, but I'm glad about, is that there's a part of my brain, I think, that because things are so strange and I'm not going outside a lot, I've almost convinced myself that like other modernities are gone, like TV. And on the weekends, I almost feel like I'm on Little House on the Prairie, and I just sit and I read by the light as if it's the only thing I can do. So,
is it candlelight?
It might as well be. So this past weekend, I read The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford, the classic modernist novel, which I think people can look up if they don't know, but I think a lot of people have read either in school or elsewhere, and it's fantastic. But because more people know that one, I actually want to talk about the book I read the weekend before, which was a real find for me and which I absolutely loved. It's a novel called A Jest of God by a Canadian writer named Margaret Lawrence, and Lawrence is spelled L-A-U. Rinse, not L-A-W. I got some of the bookish Canadian people on Twitter who follow me jokingly teasing me saying, look, everybody, it took a quarantine for American readers to find our beloved Margaret Lawrence. She is apparently kind of canonical in Canada. And last summer when I was in Edinburgh, her books were facing out on a shelf at a Waterstones, and they were in these very beautiful editions, and I'd never heard of her. So I just picked this one up and bought it, and I finally got around to it. I said to someone that I would recommend it to people who love Marilyn Robinson and William Maxwell, who we've talked about a lot on the podcast. It's a very simple and sparely told story of a school teacher who's 34 years old. Her name is Rachel Cameron, and she lives in Canada with her elderly mother. And she fears that her life is tending towards spinsterhood, as the back cover says. So she teaches these children. She has a brief and tense affair with a man who returns to town, who she grew up with, and she looks after her mother. They live above a funeral home that her father used to run, and now that someone else runs, her father is passed. I'm going to read just a couple of things because the story is so simple. Her prose is very lovely. You take about 30 pages to fall into it, and once you do, I think you're really gone, and you're just floating in it. It has also one of my favorite closing couple of pages that feel very profound. It's a lot about faith and about resentment and trying to live your life the way that you thought you were supposed to, but feeling like you haven't gotten as much as you should have. There's a page on which she looks at herself in the mirror and she says, "Women like me are an anachronism. We don't exist anymore. And yet I look in the mirror and see I'm there. I'm a fact of sorts, a fantasy of sorts. My blood runs in actual veins, which is as much of a surprise to me as to anyone." But then there are these couple of paragraphs that I'm just going to read and then I'll be done. This is when they go to church. This kind of shows both how profound but also playful and funny she can be about the faith in the book. "Here we are. Mother flicks through the hymnary to look up the hymns in advance. I wonder what she believes, if anything. She's never said. It was not a subject for discussion. She loves coming to church because she sees everyone, and in spring the new hats are like a forest of tulips. But as for faith, I suppose she takes it for granted that she believes. Yet if the Reverend McElfresh should suddenly lose his mind and speak of God with anguish or joy, or out of some need should pray with fierce humility as though God had to be there, Mother would be shocked to the core. Luckily, it will never happen. Mr. McElfresh's voice is as smooth and mellifluous as always, and he is careful not to say anything which might be upsetting. His sermon deals with gratitude. He says we are fortunate to be living here, in plenty, and we ought not to take our blessings for granted. Who is likely to quibble with that?"
Oh, I love that.
I've ordered a couple more novels of hers that are on the way.
I'm dwelling on the word spinster, which is one of those words that I had a very strong visual that I conjured as a child and never fully let go of. So I think somehow I thought of spinning wheels and came up with a big ball of loose and messy yarn, which I then also thought of as the bun on top of a head of a spinster, like in a Dickensian novel kind of way.
You know what's funny? I'm not kidding. I actually have, other than maybe the bun, I had the same image of spinsterhood when I was young.
Really?
Very similar, very similar.
It's amazing to me how spinster has been defined downward as I've gotten older. It was always like the grandmother type, and to realize that what people talked about spinsters in the past, they were talking about like 30-year-olds.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Well, the protagonist of this book is 34.
Yeah,
and she's definitely feeling it. She's a very tall, sort of gangly. She's a great character, and her voice is just lovely and pure. And I think this is the
part that you read reminded me a little bit of the book Stoner by another John Williams.
Oh God, Stoner is a whole thing to get into, Greg. We can't talk about that here. We can't get into the Stoner wars. It's too much. So what are you reading, Greg?
I'm reading a book by a guy named David Eagleman. He's a British neuroscientist and fairly renowned in that regard. He's done a BBC series. He's had some best-selling books about the brain science, including a book called The Brain. But the book that I'm reading is something that he wrote about 10 years ago, and it's fiction. It's called Sum, S-U-M. It's got a subtitle, 40 Tales from the Afterlives. And the concept of this book, it's a little bit like Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, where Alan Lightman did these kind of quick takes on different concepts of time, how time might work differently than our experience of it. David Eagleman does that in Sum with visions of the afterlife. He says, kind of, here are different ways that the afterlife might operate. It's a very philosophical book. It's actually a book that, as I've been reading it, I've thought would appeal to both of you for different reasons. It's a little bit of Ted Chiang, who, Pamela, I know you love, married with William James, who, John, I know you love. So it's this whole idea of, we'll never really know if there's an afterlife, if there is one, what it's like. And so here's this brain scientist just imagining and having fun. And it's kind of one quick flash fiction thought experiment after the next. And they're lovely. Not a whole lot of plot, but a lot of deep philosophy and irony, kind of poking fun at our human foibles, the things that we worry about.
Are they just a few pages long each?
Because they're so short, I can easily read you one.
I was going to say, I'll take the irony and give John the deep philosophy.
The language reminds me of Ted Chiang's language, because there's something very precise and exacting and a little bit technical in it, but in a way that's just very chiseled. So here's a very short one called Mirrors. This is really just a few paragraphs long. When you think you've died, you haven't actually died. Death is a two-stage process, and where you wake up after your last breath is something of a purgatory. You don't feel dead, you don't look dead, and in fact you are not dead, yet. Perhaps you thought the afterlife would be something like a soft white light, or a glistening ocean, or floating in music. But the afterlife more closely resembles the feeling of standing up too quickly. For a confused moment, you forget who you are, where you are, all the personal details of your life. And it only gets stranger from here. First, everything becomes dark in a blindingly bright way, and you feel a smooth stripping away of your inhibitions and a washing away of your power to do anything about it. You start to lose your ego, which is intricately related to the spiriting away of your pride. And then you lose your self-referential memories. You're losing you, but you don't seem to care. There's only a little bit of you remaining now, the core of you. Naked consciousness, bare as a baby. To understand the meaning of this afterlife, you must remember that everyone is multifaceted. And since you always lived inside your own head, you were much better at seeing the truth about others than you ever were at seeing yourself. So you navigated your life with the help of others who held up mirrors for you. People praised your good qualities and criticized your bad habits. And these perspectives, often surprising to you, helped you to guide your life. So poorly did you know yourself that you were always surprised at how you looked in photographs or how you sounded on voicemail. In this way, much of your existence took place in the eyes, ears, and fingertips of others. And now that you've left the earth, you are stored in scattered heads around the globe. Here in this purgatory, all the people with whom you've ever come in contact are gathered. The scattered bits of you are collected, pooled, and unified. The mirrors are held up in front of you. Without the benefit of filtration, you see yourself clearly for the first time. And that is what finally kills you.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
holy cow, Greg, when we stop this session, can I just call you and have you read the rest of that book?
It's funny, for kind of comfort viewing during the quarantine, my wife and I have been watching the show The Good Place, and this book feeds right into that too. The Good Place is set in an afterlife as well, with different versions of it taking place each time.
Greg, it's funny. We'll have to have the Contrarian podcast next week, because Stoner and The Good Place are both things that I don't think I like as much as its biggest fans do. But
John, that's such a typical mild manner way of you saying that you don't like something at all.
Pamela, what are you reading this week?
Well, I finally caught up with all that vacation reading, so I can't rely on that anymore. But I am going to go back to one of the books that I read pre-coronavirus era, and then talk about one that I read post-corona or during corona. We're not post. So the one I read before was Henry Louis Gates' most recent book, Stony the Road, which is a book that came out in 2019, and Gates was on the podcast to discuss it. And it had been on my pile of things to read for a while, but it is a heavy book. And it actually is a physically heavy book because it's very well produced. It is a largely illustrated book and beautifully published, which is a weird word to use for an ugly subject. The subject of the art, the illustrations, is very ugly, but also obviously heavy in terms of its content. And that book is about Reconstruction and redemption, which is an ironic word, which was the destruction of and the rolling back of Reconstruction during the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century and the Jim Crow period. And it's an interesting book. It's mostly a book about the culture of Jim Crow and the way in which that culture both reflected and perpetuated the racism of the time. It's a subject I've been very interested in, that period, but, when you pick up a book and you realize this isn't actually the book that I wanna read on this subject, that's kind of how I felt with the Gates. It's not that I didn't appreciate it, but I realized while reading it that the subject of cultural criticism and the culture around Reconstruction was something I was already very familiar with. One of the projects I worked on as an undergraduate was a research project for a professor who was looking at a number of moral issues in American history, but the one that I was tasked at looking at was prohibition, and specifically looking at propaganda around prohibition that was really used as a tool of racism. So the argument in most of the South, but also elsewhere in the States, was that alcohol led to Black men raping white women and to miscegenation. And my job at that time was to go into really a great library of early American archives. And I spent a long period of time, day after day, in that library looking at magazines and newspapers at the time and the political cartoons and just the sort of general propaganda at the time around that. And a lot of that is reproduced in Gates's book. So that was sort of familiar to me. What's less familiar to me and what I think I want to read next on that subject is the detailed political and social history, so that the acts themselves, what was actually going on, particularly on a local level during Reconstruction, and the ways in which those laws were then overturned. I think that's what I want to read next, or something that's more grounded in the lives, maybe David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass. But it was nonetheless, it's a very well done book. And I think for people who aren't familiar with that period, probably revelatory. The one revelation for me was that George Cruikshank, who I think is probably familiar to a lot of readers as the illustrator of many of Dickens's novels, notably The Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist, which I'd recently been turning back to with my kids, was a terrible racist and drew a lot of really horrible political cartoons at the time perpetuating racist imagery. So it was very odd to see his name at the bottom of these really hideous images when I had previously associated him with Dickens's novels. So that's the book I read before coronavirus. The book I read immediately upon being
Shut in.
Thank you. It's not a closed door mystery, but it's a mystery, a classic mystery. And I thought about one of our former colleagues, Radhika Jones, wrote an essay about the joys of Agatha Christie. And I haven't read much Agatha Christie, but I've read even less of Dorothy Sayers. That is to say, I had never read Dorothy Sayers. Right. And I picked up a book called Strong Poison that calls Dorothy Sayers the mistress of the Golden Age mystery. And it's a Lord Peter Wimsey mystery featuring Harriet Vane. So all of these names were not familiar to me. I dove in. It is a really fun book. It's about a novelist named Harriet Vane who is writing a novel about poisoning in large part poisoned by arsenic, when her ex-lover is killed by arsenic poisoning. So she is immediately imprisoned until Lord Peter Wimsey, detective extraordinaire, comes to the rescue, falls in love with her, and is determined to get her out of prison. There's just many delights within this book, but I'm going to read only one small bit. This is about a woman on the jury who believes that Miss Vane is innocent. And they're talking about this woman, and Dorothy Sayers writes, "They bullied her a good deal, of course, because she couldn't lay a finger on any real weakness in the chain of evidence. But she said the prisoner's demeanor was part of the evidence and that she was entitled to take that into consideration. Fortunately, she is a tough, thin, elderly woman with a sound digestion and a militant high church conscience of remarkable staying power, and her wind is excellent. She let 'em all gallop themselves dead, and then said she didn't believe it, and wasn't going to say that she did." "Very useful," said Sir Impey. The names here are great. "A person who can believe all the articles of the Christian faith is not going to boggle over a trifle of adverse evidence. But we can never hope for a whole jury box full of ecclesiastical diehards."
That's great.
This came out in 1930. It's a lot of fun. One other thing I just want to note is the name of some of the journalists in the book. Waffles Newton is one. Cuthbert Logan is the second, and the third is Freddie Arbuthnot. So I love those old Fleet Street names.
My Twitter handle has to change now.
Waffles Coles.
Is there anything before we go that you're avoiding reading?
I'm just trying not to read anything too bleak, I think. He says, having just said that he's reading about the afterlife.
I know, seriously, Craig. You have no credibility on that. I'm sorry. All right. Well, a pleasure visiting with all of you in your respective bunkers.
Let's run them down again.
All right, Greg?
I'm reading Some, S-U-M, by David Eagleman.
I read A Jest of God by Margaret Lawrence.
And I read Stony the Road by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Dorothy Sayers' Strong Poison. All right. Thanks, all.
It was very nice to do this again.
It was very nice to have you back.
Great to be here.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.